Hello and welcome to Abstract AF. I'm Sneha Jaswal, and in this episode, I'm going to be talking about the fictional novel Girl A by Abigail Dean. More specifically, I'm going to explain the climax that might have been a little confusing for a few readers. So let's talk about the plot first. And I'm going to read out the blurb from the book that sums up the story quite well. The protagonist is Lex Gracie, a lawyer, and Lex doesn't want to think about her family. She doesn't want to think about growing up in her parents' house of horrors, and she doesn't want to think about her identity as Girl A, the girl who escaped. When her mother dies in prison and leaves Lex and her siblings the family home, she can't run from her past any longer. Together with her sister Evie, Lex intends to turn the House of Horrors into a force for good. But first, she must come to terms with her 6 siblings and with the childhood they shared. So, like the blurb suggests, with each chapter, we slowly get to understand just what happened in this House of Horrors and what kind of characters the Gracie children are. The Gracie children, I think that sounded like crazy, sorry. Well, while I was reading the book, I couldn't help but think how it sounded like some case that I might have read about online. And turns out the book is eerily similar to an American case involving a couple called the Turpins who isolated and abused their 13 children, depriving them of food and keeping them in extremely cramped and unhygienic conditions. The case came to light in 2018 when one of the kids managed to escape and reported the abuse to the police. Girl A came out in 2021, and some of the things in the book is straight up lifted off the Turpin case. Let's talk about the Gracie children one by one to understand the plot better. First, there is the protagonist Alexandra, who's simply called Lex, and known to investigators of the Gracie case as Girl A. In chapter 1, she visits the prison where her mother, Deborah Gracie, died and is informed that Deborah left behind a sum of £20,000 and their house on Moorwoods Road in Hollowfield. It's where the abuse took place, and that all of this is to be divided equally between Lex and her 6 other siblings. We're made to understand that the Gracie children were pulled out of school, isolated at home, tied to their beds, and maltreated by their religious father, while their mother was a silent participant in the neglect and abuse of her own kids. Mr. Gracie hopes to start his own church, and when he isn't able to attract any followers, he starts preaching to just his children and makes them suffer. It was Lex who finally one day manages to escape from the house and reports their plight to the police. All the kids are rescued, put under the care of mental health practitioners, and then placed with foster families. The father commits suicide just before the cops are able to nab him, so the mother is the only one who goes to prison. Lex is adopted by a kind cop and gets along well with her new parents. She decides to turn their old home, the one that is left by their mother to all the kids, into a community center with a children's library, and she needs to get all her siblings to agree to the plan. And this is how we slowly get to know about the other siblings in the book. The eldest of the Gracie children is Ethan, or Boy A. He was almost 18 when they were all rescued from the House of Horrors. Lex and all the other younger kids really looked up to Ethan because he was the most intelligent and academically inclined of the lot, and they hoped it would be him who would finally find a way to save them from their parents' abuse. However, when they were actually rescued, Ethan was the only one who wasn't deplorably dressed or malnourished, and it made the investigators wonder if he oppressed his younger siblings along with the father. But none of the kids actually testify against him. And it doesn't help that the author doesn't outrightly crucify him as a villain. Ethan is a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde kind of character, so we see him both as a caring brother and as a paranoid, narcissistic man inclined towards violence. As someone who was almost an adult, he could be considered as guilty for the sufferings of his siblings, but there's also the truth that Ethan became more complying with his father after he realizes he cannot do much to stand up to him. So he chooses to be on the side of the oppressor, constantly warning Lexi and the other kids that the father would kill them if they don't obey. Delilah, or Girl B, is the 3rd sibling, the prettiest of them all, who was always ready to please her father and mother, even though they mistreated them so terribly. She doesn't get along too well with Lex, and while she's portrayed as a beautiful, conceited woman, she seems to be the most mentally strong character, who goes on to marry a rich man and have an almost normal life. She has a strained relationship with Lex, but is very close to her younger brother Gabriel, and helps him out whenever he's in need. And well, we might as well talk about Gabriel now, the 4th sibling, or Boy B. He's said to be a slow child, bullied at school, and things only get worse when they're confined to the house. Gabriel is adopted by a fairly wealthy family called the Colson Browns, who treat him more like a curiosity to display when they're entertaining guests than a son that they should be looking after. The family would reach out to TV channels, newspapers, local celebrities to meet their new son, the boy who was rescued from the infamous House of Horrors. So instead of being pulled away from his traumatic past, Gabriel is constantly made to relive it, and this obviously kind of screws him. After he grows up, he too tries to make off money from his tragic past and gets himself an agent who helps him get spots in true crime conventions and Halloween parties. Not too surprisingly, Gabriel spirals down a path of alcoholism and drugs and ends up being institutionalized. I think he comes off as the most concrete character in the book, even though flawed, at least there's nothing confusing about his personality. In the novel, Abigail Dean skips boy C and moves on to boy D, who's called Noah, the boy who was only a toddler when the kids were rescued. So he has the smoothest rehabilitation and leads a normal, happy life, blissfully unaware of who his biological parents were, and he has no idea that he has siblings. Now, because Abigail Dean keeps flitting between the past and the present, the book can become quite confusing for a lot of readers, and especially confusing to keep track of who these seven siblings are. So, if you missed understanding who Boise was, Boise who doesn't have a chapter to himself, it's Daniel, who dies as a baby and is discovered in a plastic bag in a kitchen cupboard by the cops. The author doesn't explicitly reveal how Daniel dies, so it's up to us to assume that he either died of malnutrition or was beaten to death by his father. Either way, Daniel doesn't survive. And now to girl C. Evie, the youngest sister, and Lex's favorite sibling, her pillar of strength through the abuse, who Lex promised to save. We get a lot of touching moments between these sisters, only to finally discover that Evie never left the House of Horrors. She was only 10 years old and died due to starvation. She was declared dead at the hospital a day after Lex escapes. Evie's death is revealed in the second last chapter. Until then, we see a lot of interactions between Lex and her, which are written in a way that leads readers into believing that she was a survivor too, that Evie is alive. But turns out, interacting with Evie was Lex's way of coping with her trauma because her therapist, Dr. D, tells Evie is safe and has been adopted by a family whose identity cannot be disclosed. Now, Dr. D admits that she lied to Lex initially about Evie being alive because after escaping and seeking help, she collapses due to the exhaustion and starvation, and the first thing she asks when she wakes up is, where is Evie? So everybody understands that Evie is extremely important to Lex, so the therapist believes that maybe not disclosing her the truth of Evie's death initially would help her recover faster. So for 3 months, Lex is made to believe that Evie is alive, but after she constantly keeps badgering Dr. D about where her sister is and why she cannot be adopted by the same family, Dr. D finally tells her the truth that Evie is dead, but Lex refuses to believe it. Instead, she starts to have imaginary conversations with Evie. She pretends to talk to her on the phone or pretends that she's in the room with her. And eventually, even though Dr. D and her parents are aware that she's having these imaginary conversations, they let it slide. Because in all other ways, Lex does completely fine. She goes on to have a good academic record. She goes on to have a successful career. So they all just let it slide. It's only after Lex goes back to the House of Horrors to turn it into a community center. She visits it the first time after she had first escaped from the place, and that's when she finally realizes that Evie never left that house. She has a hard time accepting this. So we have a kind of a bittersweet ending where Lex does know that her sister is dead, but continues to imagine her out there and agrees to see a new therapist to get over it. But until she does get better, she chooses to spend time in her own fictional world, where one of her favorite persons is still by her side. Some readers seem to be confused over why Lex was dumped by her lawyer boyfriend, who was very serious about her and wanted to marry her. The thing is, while we don't know if Lex was sexually abused by her father, she was definitely beaten up mercilessly by the man, and there's this particular horrifying scene where she suffers terrible abdominal injuries. So that's where we can make the assumption that the abuse left her unable to have kids, and that was a deal breaker for her boyfriend, who wanted to have his own biological children. So this is where Evie's presence, even if imaginary, becomes more necessary for Lex, because she's the only person who loves Lex unconditionally. That's really what Girl A is all about. Adults haunted by a traumatic past, trying to move on with their lives. That is all for this episode. Talk to you in the next one.